Welcome to Joining the Dots. I'm Thomas Strohan, your host. This podcast explores real-life insights from those dedicated to pursuing justice, reducing harm, and enhancing global security. As co-founder of Clue Software and a technologist, I collaborate daily with diverse teams tackling some of the most pervasive problems in the world, ranging from child abuse to human trafficking, organised crime, fraud, and much more. In Joining the Dots, I speak with those deeply entrenched in these worlds. The victims, the perpetrators, the investigators, the leaders, the techies, the academics. The often unsung heroes on the front line, working to tirelessly create a safer world. Welcome to Joining the Dots. Hello, today we have an incredibly special guest here, Neville Blackwood, an international law enforcement consultant, a former senior police officer, and an impressive career tackling serious and organised crime and major incidents. Neville has worked across continents and crises in some of the most sensitive global situations over the course of many years. Think international kidnappings, murders, terrorist attacks, natural disasters, you get the idea. From Kenya to Iraq, Neville has worked in areas including counterterrorism, gender-based violence, working directly with police teams, with prosecutors, NGOs and political leaders. In Somalia, he advised the British Embassy and he mentored the Somali Police Counter-Terrorism Unit. He's also led initiatives in Pakistan, Morocco and across southeastern Europe, providing specialist support around major crime investigations. Neville has a unique perspective on the state and challenges of international law enforcement, particularly in developing nations. So that's why I'm really interested and looking forward to this conversation. So first of all, welcome, Neville.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Pleasure to be here.
Nice to be here, and thanks so much for travelling down to Bristol for this. Now, just to orientate you and our listeners, we have a consistent format for our interview. We kick off with the same question, which explores why you chose the path you chose. Secondly, we look into the main part of the conversation. Some of that introduction will give a good clue as to what we're going to talk about. And then lastly, we end by asking our guests to transport themselves into 2030 and to give us sort of crystal ball predictions, insights into some of the upcoming threats. So if you're happy with that, we'll get going.
Yeah, fantastic. Let's go for it.
Brilliant. Okay, the pivotal moment ultimately led you on your chosen path. And also, if you can, a moment that led you to understand the impact that technology would likely have on your journey.
Okay. Well, back in 1982, that's when I joined Thames Valley Police. And I had been a student at the University of Reading prior to that. So that was quite an interesting spread of knowledge and experience from a campus university to actually policing the streets of Reading. And who'd have thought, sort of fast forward almost 40 years, I would be doing some of the things that you described. So the pivotal moment for me was joining Thames Valley Police and becoming a police officer, and the huge opportunities that type of professional work now offers. The pivotal moment for me going into the international arena that I'm very proud to have been involved in and found so many fantastic experiences from was probably when I was working for the specialist operations in New Scotland Yard, and we were targeting organised criminal groups using some very innovative surveillance tactics and undercover operations to push forward on some major criminals in the southeast of London. And I had an opportunity to do a undercover operation out in Germany. And that was an absolutely mind-blowing experience. I'd done international work prior to that, but for me it was so immensely exciting, but impressive because of that bilateral arrangements and agreements that we had, that I could move an informant into Hamburg, infiltrate an undercover operative within a OCG, organised crime group, in Germany. And we worked very closely with the National Crime Agency equivalent of the Germans. And we were doing some amazing tactics to deliver on securing investigative evidence, potentially with a witness that was going to come and give evidence either in Hamburg or jointly in the UK about a major crime network that was spanning a number of borders. And for me, that whetted my appetite. But I then moved on to the Serious and Organised Crime Agency, that allowed me to do another similar sort of work, where we were looking to evidence ecstasy being bought from an organised crime group in Eindhoven, and using a surveillance team starting from the UK. We followed a UK national from the southeast of England through the ferry into Eindhoven, and working very closely with the Dutch police, we infiltrated a organised crime network there, and we witnessed and evidenced a drug deal, a transaction of a very large amount of ecstasy, and we followed the criminal group and the criminal individual back through the UK through what's called a controlled delivery. So all fully authorised, both ends of the spectrum, and so that we facilitated the import of drugs with a view to actually hitting the network across these different countries. And that worked extremely well, and it meant the prosecution service here in the UK were working closely with the prosecutors out in Holland. And the whole process was an amazing experience to be involved in, because I was literally working with a surveillance team in this country, then working with a Dutch surveillance team in another country, and evidencing something that eventually led to the conviction of some very serious people from the UK and in Holland for that importation. And you do sometimes have to pinch yourself and think, this is something out of a TV film. It's fascinating, but it's actually delivering justice and accountability. You're actually going to get some of the bad people convicted, but you're working closely with so many different agencies, whether it's your own law enforcement colleagues, the police, or the prosecutors in different countries. And the logistics of getting something like that off the ground is quite immense, but when it works, it's incredibly rewarding.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the interesting perspective here, is this organised crime, and any form of crime, has no respect for national borders, and often within law enforcement, you are hampered by national borders in terms of, if you're working in a UK police force, you have to liaise with a foreign force, whereas your experiences you sat over that experience and you saw sort of both ends of it, and you were able to sort of help, if you like.
Yeah, and UK law enforcement is improving and developing its capability to cross networks and international boundaries. So, for example, the National Crime Agency have liaison officers based in lots of different countries around the world and have regional responsibility for supporting international and overseas investigations. And similarly, we have the counter-terrorist liaison police officers based in different countries. And there is, within the National Police Chief Council, an International Police Assistance Service. So the UK is growing in its capability to actually deliver on these international borders, and making sure that the criminals are never one step ahead, because that's always the danger. They are going to be, exploiting these boundaries to great effect and to great enrichment. But it needs this international collaboration to deliver on breaking down these organisations and targeting the kingpins and locking them away, whether it's in Holland, Pakistan, or whichever country you're talking about. It's a joint multi-agency effort, and it's so important to get that right.
Yeah. I mean, we see even today. I mean, I see, organised crime havens. In certain areas, you hear about it. For example, Dubai is quite a popular spot at the moment for logical reasons around between the UK and the UAE in terms of how our interaction works. So there still are sort of pockets of challenge, I suppose, but there's lots of examples of it working really well.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, you alluded to one of the areas that I've worked on is within the Balkans and Eastern Europe. And that was a classic situation. So you have a lot of former Yugoslavian countries now who are operating together in a cross-border network to try and prevent and dismantle and prosecute organised crime. But there does seem to be some challenges in relation to what you could call almost no-go areas. For example, parts of northern Kosovo, parts of Albania. You could say that the criminals have got the upper hand in actually how some regions are controlled. And there are situations in some of the locations that I've mentioned where cannabis, for example, is grown almost with impunity. It's part of the industry of that country, almost to the extent that you would see the likes of Colombia with the cocaine cartels, who provide some of the most lucrative profits for that country's gross national product every year. So that is some of the challenge, is the corruption that is going to be endemic in some of those countries, and actually having a law enforcement that can face up to those risks and challenges and deliver on some meaningful criminal interface where you get people prosecuted, let alone dismantling these organisations, because you're up against sometimes, the same police force that you're meant to be working side by side with.
Yeah. So that kind of gets us into the main bit of the conversation, which it just to set the scene. If we talk about some of the countries that I mentioned in my introduction, difficult to characterise and generalise, obviously, on an international basis, but lots of developing nations, perhaps with a government and enforcement and police and legal system that aren't as developed as the UK. As I say, difficult to generalise, but it'd be interesting to get your insights in terms of, observations of the state of international law enforcement within that context.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I do want to emphasise is the UK is spending a lot of money to develop the capability and capacity of some of these countries. So the UK does recognise the risk of organised crime across the global arena, and how it's important to push forward and push the envelope up to achieve capacity and capability within some of these countries so that you can operate safely and securely. And the government, for example, has an overseas security and justice assessment that's done for all the countries that we operate in. And that's one of the things that is really important for me when I go out to do some of the deployments. So whether I'm working for the UK or the US, that there is a human rights element to what you're doing. It's not just to go out and see that country improve dramatically and it doesn't then deliver more safety and security and peace for the UK. It's all about preventing upstream those downstream activities that then cause harm and trauma to people within the UK. So that's the sort of bedrock of how I have comfort and confidence that I'm going out trying to do something as part of a consistent and well thought through plan that the UK is generating. So a lot of the work that I have done has been for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And it's important to recognise the great work that's happening there. So some of the challenges is operating in countries like Iraq, like Somalia, but even countries in Western Africa that I've operated in, or Eastern Africa, is to ensure that the people that the UK has in those countries, whether they're National Crime Agency agents or counter-terrorist liaison police officers, is that we have confidence in operating together with a trusted partner in that country. And one of the things that is important is to upskill the capabilities of units within those countries that on a human rights level can deliver some really forward-thinking and innovative tactics to dismantle and target organised crime and prosecute. So it has a benefit to that country, but also protects the UK from the organised crime groups and the extremists and terrorists that would want to do harm to Brits in those countries or back home in the UK. So it's that constant ability to work in the field with the operatives there, making sure that at the highest level, commissioners of police, top prosecutors, you are working to the context and developing their skills and their multi-agency capacity to operate effectively against the criminal groups, like you suggested before, have no qualms about the borders. It doesn't matter. But as far as UK policing does, borders are everything. Sovereignty and territorial integrity is paramount to how countries operate. But security is the primary role of the governments in those countries around the world. So it's important that the UK, with its own background of highly developed over many years, can deliver support and work with colleagues, whether it might be in Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, or West Africa, but in a meaningful and practical way, not showing lots of things that is impossible to achieve in those countries, but working to some practical solutions to make sure you're, like I keep on saying, is you're one step ahead of the criminal groups that, care less about the borders. It's about the economic prosperity and funding of their own entities, and they will protect that at all levels.
So there's that sort of situation you talked through there, which is where you need good high level support from the UK with collaborative work with the host country. But what's the reality when the rubber hits the road? What are some of the challenges that you see on an international basis? Some of these developing countries that just are just there, and you've got to sort of somehow deal with it.
Well, if I can start with one of the great opportunities is virtually everywhere that I've operated in, and I've been to 55 different countries working in one capacity or another, is that the individuals that I work with are often absolutely at the top of their game. They are really, really switched on people. So you've got a willing group of people who want to do the right thing. So it's often a pleasure to work with those individuals and those teams. But what they lack is the knowledge and experience and capacity to deliver on some of the things that you need to have if you're targeting organised crime, because their sophistication goes with the lucrative business that they are in. And they will have very, very switched on people working for them or leading them, and they always want to be ahead of the game and compromising those good people that are working. So some of the challenges, and I've talked about this already, will be corruption. It's a lot of the countries are very poor, and the people who work in law enforcement don't get paid what you could regard as a reasonable living wage, bearing in mind they're targeting some people that are multi-millionaire dollars, whatever currency you're talking about, and they really do have an opportunity to get the taste of the good life in a negative way through corruption, and that's one of the things that is a huge issue for.
Well, so it's an issue in the UK, let alone an issue within a developing nation. I mean, I just wonder how you go about that. Where do you start?
Yeah, well, one of the things is it's important to establish that there is a code of conduct, a sort of a moral and ethical pathway that those countries want to operate in, and it's working out on the basis of everything you do on a day-to-day level, are you doing it in an ethical way? Is your code of conduct within your organisation something that can bear some sort of scrutiny? And there is robust mechanisms to protect individuals who might be corruptible and prevent them from having those opportunities and taking advantage of them. So it's important that at the very outset, the people that you're working with have that integrity and that professionalism, because once you've got that energy and that confidence you're working with the right people, and oftentimes you can really harvest all the tactics and technology that's out there to really drive those organisations forward, to really counter the threats within that country. But it's so important that the professional organisations you operate with, whether it is the police, the prosecutors, the judges, they do have that confidence that they're going to do the right thing by the community, and the community likewise support the professionals in doing that work. Yeah, and that's one of the problems. Sorry to interrupt. One of the problems is that the trust and confidence from the community is one of the issues that prevents informants coming forward or people wanting to give evidence, because they're more fearful of the criminal groups that have the power and control than the law enforcers.
Well, what you paint, and I might be just wrong here, but what you paint is a really quite optimistic view. You find the right cohort of people that are already in country, and you find the judiciary who are, you make sure they want to do the right thing. And but what happens when you get helicoptered in and some or very little of that is there? I mean, is that a due diligence thing that you established before, so you just probably wouldn't go if there wasn't at least a core of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So most of the organisations that will deploy people like myself into these different countries have a plan. There is a strategic programme that is looking to achieve objective A via these different aims. So at the highest level, whether it's through the ambassadors or the high commissioners or the people that have the power out in these countries, is that you've got buy-in from the country in particular. So, for example, if I'm working out in West Africa, and I've worked out in the Gambia and Ghana and places like that, the level of contribution and buy-in is at the highest. It's from the presidents, the attorney generals, the Homeland Security ministers, and you're not just parachuting yourself in and just taking a wing and a prayer and hoping for the best. It's you've got a joined up approach where the government at the highest level wants you to work with them, and both parties can learn, and you're working in a collaborative manner, but you have a strategic plan that might go over 3 to 5 years, and it's in harmony with the strategic plan of the police, the prosecutors or the judges, and it's all about the security and justice sector operating in a healthy environment. Sometimes there are some challenges on achieving this because corruption will go across all different levels, but it's certainly on an international level. From the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, it's important to have the actors within those countries at the highest level, so the people that you're training or mentoring or supporting have got the support of the power brokers within that country.
And how about culture? How does our is that a factor? Out you go, and we collectively go as British sort of flag bearers of our sort of law enforcement, tradecraft and tactics, and then you go into a country that has a very different culture. Is that a challenge, or is that not as much of a challenge as I'm imagining?
No, it is a challenge, and it's very important that the people that operate within the countries have knowledge and experience of how you operate there. So when you, for example, on a training level, if I do a lot of senior investigating officer training, whether it's for counter-terrorism or homicide investigations or major crime investigations, I will always do a training plan and a package that is bespoke to that country. So it's not take off the shelf what the UK would do. You take off the learning and the expertise and skill sets, but you then factor it into that country. So when you are actually delivering the training, it is something that the local professionals will understand. I recently did some work out in Jamaica, and it was based on a homicide investigation, but with a big cyber element to it. And the training was all around a crime scene just north of Kingston in Jamaica, and it was based on the real big parts of organised crime within the Major and Organised Crime Agency and their expectations on a day-to-day basis, which, for example, is scammers. People in Florida get scammed into releasing a lot of money to Jamaican organised crime, and it's a massive issue in relation to funds that go into the networks in Jamaica, and it's something that you don't think about in the UK. So you have to get your mindset into the way organised crime operates in Jamaica, and where it flourishes is through scamming people in different parts of the USA.
Is that remote scamming?
Remote scamming.
Yeah, right,
so
right,
and it's incredibly
romance sort of stuff? Or?
Not at all. It's lottery scamming.
Right.
So it's literally, you are saying you have been the winner of a great big lottery windfall, but you have to pay a certain amount of money to get the benefit of it, and it opens up opportunities to steal money. And it's at an industrial level of activity. So the course that I delivered with this cyber element was all about the cultural activity of Jamaican law enforcement and the public, working with those law enforcement to see where the vulnerabilities were, but also basing the training package on a scenario that involved a very typical criminal enterprise in that country, and how to best target and prosecute the offenders within it. And you could replicate that outside of training in relation to building up skill sets in different countries, and you've got to recognise what are the problems of that particular country, and that's where the National Crime Agency people, the counter-terrorist liaison people from the UK can help you understand what the big issues at play are, whether it's cultural or just the mechanics of how criminality flourishes. And you've got to get deep understanding of how things will operate, because it's completely outside the ken of what you would be used to in the UK.
Yeah,
And that's the benefit, I think, of somebody like myself who's got that vast experience now. You learn so much from the countries. It's not just a one-way traffic. You learn so much from these countries and what you can deliver back in the UK or in other countries in different parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether I imagine a massive factor is just political instability. You know, you picture Pakistan, you think of Iraq, you think of Somalia. You know, these are governments that are have some challenge, you know, in terms of the state of democracy, if any. The way that the military interacts with that political system, how quickly political systems change. You know, how does that all factor into?
Well, it is a really important factor when you're working in some of the countries. You mentioned Somalia. For example, when I was working with the British Embassy in Mogadishu, one of the things that I was doing was working very closely with the counter-terrorist unit. So I was training and mentoring investigators into all matters of terrorism. And you can imagine, in a failed state as Somalia has been in the past, and it's leading its way to democracy, there are huge issues regarding a country where you as an individual often don't feel safe in. And I remember one time when we were looking to go out to mentor the team out in the centre of Mogadishu, we had what's called a complex attack. So Al-Shabaab went to the airfield where our base was located, and using a 7.5-ton lorry, they just blew up an IED, improvised explosive device, and it incinerated, unfortunately, the security within that gate. That then allowed, and it was a suicide bomber, so it was the person in the truck knew that they were going to die. Al-Shabaab operatives then came out with guns and hand grenades, looking to find people like myself to cause no end of destruction. And it was only the security that managed to prevent, you know, something like that really turning into a personal nightmare for myself. So you're operating in a country which you are getting terrorist attacks on a regular basis, and that was at the time just before there was an election in Somalia. So it was all about Al-Shabaab wanting to raise their profile and show how serious they were, and use terrorism to, you know, frighten people wanting to have this due process and democratic election. So, you know, those things you have to recognise, but also the people that I was training were going to be the ones that were going to be prosecuting, or certainly gathering evidence to prosecute those individuals. And how do you do that when some of those people are prepared to kill and maim and do terrible things to law enforcement and their families? So it's a massive issue regarding protecting the investigators, let alone the witnesses who may want to come forward, because it's a long-term expectation. If you're going to give evidence against these people, or you're going to investigate them, or you're going to be the judge adjudicating in relation to the cases, you need to be protected and feel that you are going to be able to do your job professionally without fear or favour and without threats and intimidation. And that's where witness protection programs come to the fore, and are really important parts of the business of pushing things forward, particularly when you're looking at organised crime networks and extremists.
Yeah, I mean, in that example, it's one thing, you're training the sort of counter-terrorism unit with a whole load of what I imagine to be incredibly valuable tradecraft around surveillance, around undercover work, around witness protection, all these sorts of things. And you've got some level of confidence at the time in terms of, the right people in there wanting to do the right thing for their country.
Yeah.
Yet there's a whole other system it's got to go through. So it has to go to the courts. You solve this problem, and then you've got the next one, which is how do you prosecute within potentially a jury that isn't, or a court system that isn't quite right, and a prison system that might also be a bit, it's lots of different moving parts. I just wonder how that all plays together.
Well, the way it plays together is all the different agencies that might be operating in these countries tend to have a human rights expectation. So I mentioned the Overseas Security and Justice Assistant sort of agenda. that is very much that although a number of the countries like Somalia will have the death penalty, so the expectation is that I'm training people who are going to prosecute people who could be then subject of capital punishment. Now, we know that the position that the UK government holds is very anti-capital punishment for all the reasons that we know about. So working in that environment, you have to be very conscious that some of the people you're training are possibly going to be corrupted and part of that organised crime network. So you have to put measures in place to protect that trade craft, protect the people that are going to go forward. That's why the investment that the British government puts in is immense, which pales into insignificance when you look at the US government. Just to give you some figures, pre the pandemic, 0.7% of the gross national income for the UK, which is about £14 billion, is spent on international development. It's been reduced within the pandemic and to 0.5%, but that still equates to about £11 billion. So that's a lot of money that is going not just into law enforcement, it's going into a lot of humanitarian and water and education. But it just goes to show that this government means business in relation to generating and promoting stabilisation in conflict zones, so that if you're out there as a UK citizen, you are looked after. But even if you are a UK citizen who has committed crime, you are protected to a certain extent in relation to your human rights, or suspected of committing crime, because that's one of the things. And we've just recently heard about the release of some of the journalists out in Russia.
Yep.
And that's a classic situation that you could argue that some countries will have state-sponsored hostage-taking, but through diplomacy and other means, you need to try and get your citizens back. And obviously, that's happened with great success just yesterday.
Yeah. So within that context, when you reflect back, what is there a particular job where that you've been involved in that you look back with a lot of pride and think, that's worked really, really well, and all these pieces have come together really well, and the part you played in it worked, but so did the various other bits. Is there a success story that jumps out to you?
Well, to be honest with you, there's a number of success stories. Some of the work that we did in the Balkans, I think that we did a lot of work working with academics, having workshops in all these different countries, and I particularly was engaged with the police, the border force, the prosecutors, and we worked really well collaboratively to talk about what the burning issues were and learning lessons of that experience. And certainly some of the work that I've done out in Iraq and Somalia, I feel that's very much an ongoing process, so that success is a continuum. It is still trying to do the right thing by these countries, but accepting that there will be some difficulties along the way. Because human rights gets breached on a regular basis within those countries, but you have to recognise that the boulder that you're chipping away at is a massive one, and it's going to take a lot of focus and intense work that is not just going to stop just with the last deployment. It's going to be an ongoing effort from the UK, the Europeans, the US, the Americans, and working very closely together. And it's an incredibly healthy working environment. But sometimes the challenges can be perceived to be, well, we're spending a lot of money in these countries, to what benefit and result? Well, some of these benefits and results are quite unseen. It's dismantling the organised crime or the terrorists to prevent what is the criminal activity that might appear on the streets of the UK. And that prevention is often something that quietly gets done in the background to no great applause and shouting.
So there's a bit of a marketing challenge in terms of explaining some of the return on investment in some ways that comes from that. That's a whole conversation in itself. But just to go to the other, what I perceive, and you might correct me, but I perceive to be almost the other end of the spectrum in terms of recognised success is the Balkans. I think in many ways, when you look at the fact that there hasn't been any issue, particularly, there's a recent flaring of issues in Kosovo, I think, and Serbia around sort of nationalist sort of intent. But broadly speaking, there was a war 25 years ago, I maybe more now, and there hasn't been an uprising. There hasn't been any significant flaring up of war or anything like that I've certainly noticed. So is that perhaps an example of where it's worked?
Well, I think it's a good example of where things have worked, because it was a massive issue to try and rebuild and establish bridges of cooperation from what were formerly warring entities. And that brings me up to some of the other areas that I've done in the investigation of war crimes. Now, Bosnia, for example, was unfortunately a classic example where rape as a weapon of war was used. So tens of thousands of women were raped and humiliated and terrorized, and it was a weapon used by the warring factions to deliver that fear and that power and control and humiliation. And that is something that happens even now in countries that have ongoing conflicts as we speak, where rape is a genuine weapon that is used by the military to further their conflict. And one of the things that we've recognised from the activity in the likes of Bosnia is that this is a big issue and it needs to be dealt with. So again, citing some of the work that the UK government has done, they've done incredible amount of work of preventing sexual violence on an international level. And I've done a lot of training and mentoring and support of countries where gender-based violence is a real problem. And that has generated a lot of good results in some of the countries. And the Balkans and Eastern Europe is probably an example where, after many years of working closely with the entities in those countries, they are working more effectively together and very peaceful in so many ways. But then there is some conflicts that you think could just spark up with a moment's notice. Yeah, which is, I suppose, it goes on to my next question, which is, one of the things you mentioned earlier was that these things are ongoing. It's not really an in and out; it's an ongoing thing, with highs and lows and regressions. I just wonder if you have an example of a situation that isn't going as planned and perhaps isn't quite as you expected, and I wonder why. What might some of the triggers behind it that might not have led to the level of success that we as a government and as Britain thought it might be? Yeah, well, some of the areas that I've already talked about, the likes of Iraq and Somalia, is that there is a huge amount of investment, but sometimes the corporate knowledge and donor fatigue kicks in. So you can have a great willingness to do the right thing by some of these countries, but sometimes the countries themselves don't necessarily push forward with the same sense of energy and vigour that countries like the UK and the US would like. So sometimes, and you can see that with the volatility in the Middle East at the moment, is the amount of work that was done with the United Nations providing funding for the Palestinian community. Now that you can see has caused huge amounts of sensitivity around, was that funding properly utilised? And we're talking about billions of dollars from different agencies have been pumped into that country. And now what happened with the terrible attack by Hamas last year in October, that is a country where huge amounts of effort has been done to support the Palestinians, to work closely with the Israelis, and the volatility that has kicked off as a result of the Hamas attack and the very disputed issues that are going on in that region, which could burn out into other areas like Iraq and Iran and Syria within that context. So you've got areas that I've worked in particular. I've worked on war crime investigations in relation to the Syrian conflict. I've worked closely with people in Iraq, but you can see that's a tinderbox of problems that could just mushroom beyond any control. But at least the UK and the US and other governments have done as much as they possibly can in an environment that is fraught with so many religious and sectarian issues that are quite complex. Yeah, I mean, that you've been very complimentary about the British and the US sort of response to these things, recognising that there is a huge amount of complexity in these situations. But I guess also there's challenges there in terms of funding. Sometimes, I mean,
I heard about some of the funding that was going into Syria, and we all thought it was going into reconstructing schools, and it was actually going into financing military groups and things like that. And so I guess with the best will in the world and the best intentions, sometimes this can happen.
But the City of London Police have a dedicated unit to look at funding and bribery and corruption, and where some monies may be taken into the criminal network. And you have to recognise, and people don't go in a naive way, that there's a huge amount of eye-watering amount of money that goes into some of these countries, and it can get misused, whether it's misused on a level of arming the militias or providing funding for the organised crime networks. But also, I remember when I was working in Uganda, I was working very closely with the Ugandan anti-terrorism police, and we were also working with Somali police coming into Uganda. And at the time that I was operating within that area, the British government decided that they were not going to pay the Ugandan government directly, because a lot of the money or a significant amount of the money was going to the president and his family and private jets and things that were completely unacceptable. And that's one of the things you have to recognise, is that sometimes the people you're actually brokering business with are not necessarily going to be working to the same ethical standards as you would hope, but through diplomacy and operating at different levels and giving funding by other means, you're trying to protect that, so you deliver as you get you maximise the funding and the potential outcomes.
Yeah, well, I suppose the point there is it's a risk-based approach. You talk about going in with your eyes wide open, recognising these challenges, and there might be situations where you have to pull the plug in if you do identify these issues. And
you have to be very careful about some of the things that you're working with. Some of the countries I've talked about, and I include Uganda, has a very robust position in relation to homosexuality. In fact, at one point, the Ugandan authorities were considering making homosexuality a capital offence. So at the same time that you're talking to Ugandan police and prosecutors about doing things in an ethical way, and looking to get to the hard-to-reach communities, you're in a very difficult and sensitive situation where you know that the law of that particular land is very anti something that you accept as an everyday part of life in the UK. And that's some of the dilemmas that you have to operate with. When you talk about some of the cultural issues you're up against, you are talking to people who you reference hard-to-reach groups like the homosexual groups, and you have to then deal with people who feel, well, they shouldn't be committing criminal acts, should they? And that's something that, as a trainer or as a mentor, you have to get through, and it can be incredibly challenging and difficult.
Yeah. So one of the things I know is a passion of yours, when we spoke before, and perhaps I'll give you an opportunity just to contextualise this, but it is around covert activity, covert work, surveillance, managing witnesses and things like that. I perhaps wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about where you have deployed that and where it's been successful, without obviously going into too much tradecraft or anything like that. But perhaps.
Well, certainly I've deployed it in a number of countries. I won't necessarily mention some of the companies because some of this activity is still ongoing. Yeah. But just to give you a flavour of some of the things you're talking about, when it comes to prosecuting people in many of the countries I've operated in, the way that they would like to prosecute is offenders caught what you call in flagranti, actually in the act of committing that crime. And the concept of conspiracy offences is something that is difficult for those countries to prosecute. They might have the legislation that accommodates that, but the courts would much rather having direct evidence of man A attacking man B with CCTV or direct eyewitness evidence of what's happened. Now, organised crime doesn't do things as simply as that. And the way to tackle organised crime is to use undercover infiltrations, surveillance tactics, operating against the criminal groups on their technical exposure. Yeah. So, for example, when it comes to cyber-enabled crime, that isn't necessarily simply fraud or criminality on the internet. It's using tactics that will gain huge amounts of money for the perpetrators, and by the same token is an opportunity for law enforcement to gather information from those entities. So open source intelligence is a massive way that law enforcers can exploit the internet and the activity. It's crazy, but it's an actual fact of life. If you look at extremism, a lot of the work I did in Iraq, for example, was people out in different parts of Iraq, on the foreign fighters in other parts of the world, brandishing their AK-47, really happy and proud to be in that country, committing these atrocities. So when those foreign fighters come back from the different conflicts they've been in, you're utilising the cyber technology to confirm that the person who is purporting to be an ISIS member or a member of a terrorist group is the same person that you've now got in custody. And you do your identification through digital media, and confirming through extensive work that is potentially going to be played out in a court that shows man A in Syria was in fact a foreign fighter from Iraq who's now returned and thinks that he's going to get away with the criminal activity that he carried out in those different countries. But you've now say, well, you're now caught on video. We've now done a full assessment of your facial features, and you were the same person in that image, and you are therefore an ISIS terrorist, and you will be prosecuted for that. And when it comes to organised crime, one of the things that I've tried to develop is exploiting the opportunities, for example, in relation to mobile phones. Now, we've all heard of the burner phones that the criminal network will use, and they genuinely still do use the mobile phones that you'll throw away because they think that that phone is something that they can dispose of, and law enforcement won't gain access to it. But using the technology and targeting mobile phones is an excellent way of proving a conspiracy. So you will see people building up to their criminal act, the actual act itself, then the aftermath, then that phone or that digital media gets disposed of. And it's important that you work on that to deliver the maximum evidence you can get it. So, for example, telephone interception in the UK can only ever be used for intelligence. In many other countries, it's an absolute critical way of getting evidence. So it's evidential. So if you can put an interception, a wiretap, on a telephone, that's part and parcel of...
Am I right in saying that's actually more the norm?
More than norm.
The UK is a bit of an exception in that.
Very much
regard.
so. You have to get the Home Secretary to sign off on a warrant of an interception in the UK, and in fact, it's a criminal offence to even talk about using that technology in a particular environment in the UK because it's such a treasured way of trying to gain the intelligence and using the intelligence to evidence the activity for a court. But if I'm operating in another country, whichever country that might be, with an evidential telephone tap, that's one mechanism by which you can get the baddies talking directly about what they're getting up to. The other thing is incoming and outgoing call data. It's cell site analysis. You can see the groups working together. In fact, I worked in one particular jurisdiction where we had a classic situation of cell site analysis that showed the criminal gang of 7 people using these throwaway phones that they thought were unique to them and nobody was going to get to know about it. And using incoming call data and cell site, we could track their communications on the night of their criminal activity and evidence that. And then when actually the arrest phase came into being, we seized some of these phones, whether it was their personal phones or the burner phones that they still had in their possession, and you could extract the evidence from them. So the audio records of people talking, or WhatsApp, which they thought was encrypted, or Instagram, and they caught a cold in relation to that because you've captured the phone and you can access the encrypted data that they're holding. So just on mobile phones alone, you can achieve so much. And again, within the conspiracy element of it, you can use CCTV. Most countries, and UK is a classic in relation to bristling with CCTV, and it's making sure that your cell site will show CCTV of a car, a motorbike, or a person in that vicinity to confirm that phone is in their hands.
Yeah. So just quickly to pause a minute in terms of the context here is a lot of these jurisdictions you've worked in would be, just for my benefit, would be really can quite easily prosecute a smoking gun where there's where something has happened and there is clear evidence of it happening. So there is a CCTV of someone getting shot and there's the victim who has unfortunately been shot. That's sort of a relatively simple thing. That the challenge is, and the expertise therefore that you bring to this situation is, you say, well, how about we get upstream of that? How about we find the kingpins above that? And of course what that means is you need to search for a wider set of evidence that points towards them undertaking criminal activities without them necessarily having a smoking gun.
Yeah.
And it's all of those sort of tactics that...
Well, the hierarchy of an organised crime group or an extremist terrorist group is you've got the organisers at the apex of the triangle, and then you've got the lieutenants and the power brokers and other people that then facilitate the gangsters or the extremists to do the direct hands-on attack, killing, criminal activity. So what you need to do is to cut off the top, the head of the organisation, strangle them of their oxygen, which means that you disrupt and dismantle that whole organisation before. But of course, the organised crime groups or the extremist or terrorist groups that are successful are the ones that have the hands off. We will have our criminal cell will go on and do the dirty work, but we are always removed from that, and we will always be able to perpetuate that problem. So using the conspiracy angle and targeting the criminal head and showing them, whether it's through undercover infiltration, technical infiltration, or other means, you can actually show to the court that beyond reasonable doubt of whatever the framework is within the country operating in, these people must be responsible for this criminal activity, and they therefore are in jeopardy of being prosecuted. And if you do that, then it's game on to a winning recipe. Yeah. So that's the tradecraft you're imparting on these developing prosecutorial and it's by no means easy. And one of the things that is really important is a robust witness protection program. In the UK, the National Crime Agency have the Protected Persons Service. So they don't call it witness protection because it's far bigger than witnesses. It's the witnesses, it's the informants, it's the prosecutor, it's the investigator, it's the judge. You need to make sure that they have that wraparound of protection so that every phase of the judicial journey is going to be met with a strong response from law enforcement. And people will have the confidence to put their head above the parapet to come and give evidence and consolidate the other evidence you have in relation to the conspiracy. So again, in some of the countries I've operated in, one of the benefits of having a witness protection program or a protected persons program is that the individuals that have given you the information, the intelligence, sometimes they never have to go to court because what they've done is provided you the means by which you can identify the vulnerabilities and exposure of the major criminal kingpins, and you can use technical means to evidence it, which the courts love because there's no threat of intimidation. There's just hard and fast technical evidence of man A communicating with his cell or his team on the ground doing their dirty work.
Okay. Before we end, what we tend to do, and I think we're coming to the end, unless you've got any particular reflections you want to sort of go at before we get to what I would say is our last bit, which is
I think we've covered quite an extensive area.
Isn't it? So what we do is we say, right, okay, well, let's transport ourselves into 2030. Let's think about everything we've spoken about. What do we think are some of the the threats, the opportunities? What's your reflections on where we might be by 2030?
It's an interesting thing, and I've thought about this long and hard because, of course, I've spent 40 years working in law enforcement, and on an international level, you do think, well, what is the world going to look like in 2030? Well, certainly borders are ignored by the criminal groups. they will establish themselves in a strong position. So this collaboration, this international collaboration, is a must. It goes reasonably well. I mean, we're no longer part of the EU, and we had a strong position within Europol, but that doesn't mean that Europol is not part of the UK's presence. UK will still operate very closely with the European colleagues and will be embedded within the Europol networks and other collaborative organisations across Eastern Europe and other countries. So this ability to work flexibly and adapt to the circumstances on a multi-agency level and work in task forces is going to have to be something that 2030 is going to be very much focused on, is that we are in a increasingly global network of activity, and you certainly need to be working well together and prosecuting these criminals in the right place, in the right world, but developing the understanding and the evidence to maximise the potential to prosecute these people to the best way that you can. And whether that's dismantling, but if you can prosecute the key criminals on this sort of conspiracy element, and you get those witnesses coming forward who want to point you in the right direction, or you use technology to do that. And that's where technology does come in. You know, one of the things that we think about AI, well, I've talked about CCTV identification. Well, you know, the way that things can be manipulated going forward, these deep fakes and things are just impossible to tell from, you know, the reality and what's a fake. So we need to really strengthen and understand how we can prove things going forward around, you know, who was responsible for being in that particular image or conducting that particular activity online. And this is where the criminals are working at the highest level. You know, captains of industry and some of the greatest minds are operating at a criminal level around the world. You think about what goes on in the dark web, which we haven't really touched on at all, but that's a mountain of criminality that has this.
It plays into that cross-border point you're making. It's, the dark web doesn't have any borders.
Exactly.
So,
so that's the thing is that we need to remove ourselves from being parochial and self-reflective and work out how can we establish ourselves in the international network of activity and do the right thing. And a lot of this upstreaming of activity, and that happens within the human trafficking world. There's lots of things the UK does in Vietnam and Eastern Europe to try and prevent people coming here and people being abused and victim of human trafficking. So there's a lot of collaboration, but it's a nature of the beast that you're going to have to sometimes work with countries that don't necessarily feel like comfortable brothers in arms.
Yeah. I suppose one final reflection which I might ask you on is maybe on a positive one. So as you go into these jurisdictions and you help improve the systems a bit, take the Maldives, there's a witness protection program in there, and there's lots of other programs going on international. I think developing nations are developing. That's the point. That's why we say that. So I just wonder if the global system by 2030 will be much stronger, or whether you think maybe with geopolitics it might just flatline for a bit. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, it is a challenge, and sometimes you do think, is the UK still as good as it was? So when we had tens of thousands and serious amounts of officers were lost to the UK, there was going to be a natural drain of expertise and experience. And that's one of the risks is that if we don't strengthen the UK's capability within its own boundaries, how on earth are we going to be match fit to deal with some of the other countries we operate in? And increasingly, I'm seeing some countries outperforming the way that the UK can do business in the criminal tackling criminal networks. And so there's learning both sides of it, is that information that is exposed to me from other countries, I think, wow, that's an absolutely great way of doing business, and let's learn from that. So this two-way activity is really important, and the UK needs to be very much aware that when it comes to financial resources, you need to work very closely with the overseas entities that are going to be operating, because the threat is international. It's not simply from homegrown problems. There is an international element there that you won't necessarily be, seeing and hearing about it in the newspapers because it's done quietly and covertly, and these radical extremists are being broken down before they can actually perpetrate some of these horrendous crimes. And similarly, organised crime networks are being broken, but without any great song and dance. It's the expertise of these different agents working across the world, working really well together. So really do invest in the future on the human, technical, financial resources to make that overseas element of work that we have been so good at the past, to maintain that momentum and that capability to deliver on such a huge area of business, which is just growing, it seems, incrementally in its dimensions and its capability. So it's always trying to be one step ahead, which is an easier thing to say than actually deliver on.
Yes. Neville, I think that's it now. So thank you very much for the conversation. Really appreciate you coming down.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Joining the Dots with me, Thomas Strohan. We hope you found today's conversation practical and insightful. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It really helps us reach more listeners like you. Stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to uncover the stories of those on the front line of justice, harm reduction and global security. This is Thomas Strohan, signing off. Thanks for listening.